Good evening. I'm Father Jeff Hahnemann, the priest in charge of St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, Connecticut. And this is our adult Bible study. A production of St. John's as part of our online outreach to our parishioners and friends in this time of pandemic and social distancing, and made possible with the support of viewers like you. So let me begin again by introducing myself. I've been a priest in the Anglican Communion for about 40 years. I was graduated in 1987 from Oxford University with a doctorate in the history of the early church. I'm published in the formation of the Christian Bible, and I'm an internationally recognized expert on the Muratorian fragment, for whatever that's worth. But more importantly, I am a follower of Jesus. And as such, I want to know everything I can about Jesus, about what he said, about what he did, about what he asks of us. And so where do we as Christians find that information? How do we know whether the information we find is trustworthy and accurate? How do we know what to believe? Those are the kind of statements that I, as a rational person, as a skeptic even, in my search to faithfully know and follow Jesus, I ask those. And I invite you to join me in this study. So this is part 4 of what I've suggested would be a series of studies in our search for Jesus, a series of future classes to go further and further in our quest. In part 1, we acknowledge the fact that we are thousands of years separated from the life and time of Jesus and from those who record the details of his life. And that those details that are recorded in languages that are ancient and foreign to us. And that language in and of itself is difficult to interpret sometimes. That meanings of words and phrases can change or become unknown over time, or that translations can mislead us, or that later tradition will read back into the textual interpretation something that is simply not there or may not be there. And in part 1, we looked at only a few of the many questions that occur in our biblical translations. And that class is available on the St. John's YouTube page, and I highly recommend it before proceeding if you haven't seen this. In part 2, we explored the struggle to determine the original texts of our biblical sources. Which ones are we going to use for translation? Acknowledging that there are thousands of different manuscripts of the New Testament, and new ones may still be found. And there are thousands upon thousands of variations in those texts. And the decision as to which is most authentic is not always apparent and is not always easy. In some cases, we saw in part 2 that scribes sometimes add to the text to smooth out a sense of abruptness, like with the Lord's Prayer or the ending of the Gospel of Mark. In other cases, scribes have corrected texts that were mistaken, like the beginning of Luke's Gospel's misleading reference to Isaiah. Other times we saw scribes alter the text to better fit the understanding of their own understanding of who Jesus was, like with the voice at his baptism and what it said, or Jesus' encounter with the leper in Mark. Many times the texts are altered also because of later tradition and theological considerations, and there are lots and lots of questionable variations in the text. Our best complete codices of the Gospels are from the 4th century, but the patristic fathers of the 2nd and 3rd century often quote those texts with very different readings. Thus, we need to always approach the biblical text with some hesitation, with some familiarity with the early writings of the patristic fathers, and so that we not only have problems we see with translations, but also with textual variations. In part 3, we looked at the so-called canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we noted that they were all written anonymously. Those titles, those attributions of authorship to the apostles Matthew and John, to the physician Luke, and to Mark, the translator of Peter, are all later and were added later. These attributions are derived from tradition, not from the texts themselves. This is especially obvious, I think, with the so-called Gospel of John, who was the supposed authorship being St. John the Apostle, St. John the son of Zebedee, but who is described in Acts as illiterate. And yet his name is attributed to this gospel, a gospel that never mentions him or his brother by name, his brother James. Moreover, all the events in which John the Apostle, the sons of Zebedee, are mentioned in prominent roles, like the call of the sons of Zebedee along the seashore of Galilee, or the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, or the raising of Jairus' daughter, or the transfiguration, or the Garden of Gethsemane. All those stories we find in the other Gospels of which John is present are not recorded in the fourth Gospel. And though the sons of Zebedee were known to be Galilean fishermen, all interest in the region of Galilee is lacking in this so-called Gospel of John. For the fourth Gospel, as we observed, centers more around Jesus's various visits to Jerusalem. So it's also clear from the scriptures themselves that there were, quote unquote, many accounts of the life of Jesus at the time that the so-called Gospel of Luke was written. And that, of course, raises the questions, for me at least, of whether any of these other contemporary accounts known to the Gospel of Luke, to the author of the Gospel of Luke, are known to us today, or were used as sources for the canonical Gospels themselves. And do we have them? Or if these sources are found later, would they then become part of the Christian Bible? For the time being, it is clear enough from the first lines of the so-called Gospel of Luke that the author of that gospel himself was not an eyewitness to the events described, and that he knew of many other written sources about the life of Jesus. So if there were lots of different accounts of the life of Jesus out there, who determined which were authentic and which were not? And how did they determine that? And when did they determine that? Those are some of the questions we're looking at in part 4. As we saw previously, Papias' description of the Gospel of Matthew, the first reference to this gospel that we have, he describes it as a collection of sayings of Jesus, sayings that were written in Hebrew, which is not what we have in what we call the Gospel of Matthew, but is a description similar to what we find in the Gospel of Thomas. Was Papias confused? Or was there another collection of sayings of Jesus at the end of the first century written in Hebrew? And then we saw with the synoptic problem that the hypothetical Q document deduced there also appears to be only a collection of sayings of Jesus, without narratives of his birth or his miracles or his death or his resurrection, with only parables and teachings, so that it would appear that there were numerous or several different books containing only the sayings of Jesus that were known in the late first and early second century. That was surprising to many laters, because later we make so much of his death and his resurrection and his miracles, whereas it may have been that his teachings were what caused the first followers to write down what he said. So why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in our Bible? That's the kind of question that we need to ask. As noted previously, the Gospel of Thomas was discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in December 1945. And scholars have proposed a date for the writing of this gospel as early as 60 AD, making it contemporary with, if not earlier than some of the canonical gospels, but also their scholars have dated it as late as 140, making it after when we imagine all those canonical gospels to be written. The Gospel of Thomas contains 114 supposed sayings of Jesus written in the Coptic language. Almost 2/3 of these sayings are very similar to sayings we find in the canonical Gospels. However, some modern scholars believe that the Gospel of Thomas was written independently of these canonical Gospels and wasn't drawing upon them, and is therefore a useful guide to the historical Jesus. After the Coptic version of the complete Gospel was discovered in 1945, scholars soon realized that we had 3 different Greek textual fragments found at Oxranchus, also in Egypt. These three unnamed gospel Greek fragments were indeed Greek versions of the Gospel of Thomas, which is thought to have been composed first in Greek, because at that time Greek was the lingua franca. And there is evidence that the Coptic Nag Hammadi translation text is a translation made perhaps in Syria. The earliest surviving written references to the Gospel of Thomas are found in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome, early 3rd century, who quotes saying 4 of Thomas, although the wording is slightly different and may be a matter of translation. Origen of Alexandria, early 3rd century, also appears to have known the Gospel of Thomas. And several modern scholars argue that when the logia, when the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas have parallels in the Synoptic Gospels, the version in Thomas often seems closer to the original source. And it's considered by some as one of the earliest accounts then of the teachings of Jesus. And important then in our understanding Jesus and Christianity outside the New Testament. And one must ask, and we don't have a satisfactory answer, that why, since we've recovered this text, is it not part of the Christian scriptures today? Then there's the Gospel of Peter, recovered in 1886 by the French archaeologist Urbain Bourdiant in the modern Egyptian city of Akhimim, about 60 miles north of Nag Hammadi. It's an 8th or 9th century manuscript that had been respectfully buried with an Egyptian monk in the 8th or 9th century. This fragmentary Gospel of Peter was the first non-canonical gospel to have been recovered or rediscovered in modern times and preserved, as with so many others, in the dry sands of Egypt. Although there are parallels with the 3 synoptic gospels, the so-called Gospel of Peter does not use any of the materials that we know to be unique to Matthew or to Luke, suggesting a possible relationship with earlier versions of the synoptic gospels, or with their sources. A major focus of the surviving fragment of the Gospel of Thomas is the Passion narrative, which also is the major part of the 4 canonical Gospels. And interestingly, in the Passion narrative, the author ascribes the responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus to Herod Antipas and not to Pontius Pilate. Origen, again, early 3rd century, makes mention of the Gospel of Peter as agreeing with the tradition of the Hebrews. One of the most interesting things about the Gospel of Peter to me is that it's the only known gospel to actually describe the resurrection, as seen here. And it's interesting to me that the 2 angels are seen as supporting Jesus out of the tomb, more in tune, more in line with the earlier resurrection narratives of Jesus, where he is described as being raised from the dead, passively raised from the dead, as opposed to the later tradition, which alters that proclamation and describes Jesus as more active, that Jesus rises from the dead. So that this would suggest this is an earlier version of the resurrection narrative. Indeed, there are 29 variations of fact between this gospel according to Peter and our 4 canonical gospels. The one I mentioned, that Herod is the one who gave the order for execution. It's noted that Joseph of Arimathea was a friend of Pilate. That's not specified in the canonical gospels, though it is part of early tradition. In the darkness after the crucifixion, the Gospel of Peter have people going around with lamps and falling down, a sense of startling confusion that must have seized the people after the darkness covered the earth and earthquakes began to happen. The account in the Gospel of Peter describes how the disciples had to hide because they were being searched for on suspicion of plotting to set fire to the temple. 6th, the name of the centurion who kept the watch at the tomb was Petronius, which again we find in later tradition. 7th, The resurrection and the ascension as recorded in the Gospel of Peter in verse 5 are not seen as separate events, but as occurring at the same day. Jesus is raised by those angels out of the tomb and ascends into heaven. In a similar way, the Gospel of John, or the so-called Gospel of John, which doesn't have an ascension story, has the reception of the Holy Spirit occurring on the day of resurrection and not 50 days later on Pentecost. And it should be noted that the Gospel of Peter, from which we now have an early copy, was popular in the church at Rhosis at the end of the 2nd century. This is a church on the Eastern Mediterranean in what is now probably a part of Turkey, just north of Lebanon. It was popular and being read there in the liturgy, the Gospel of Peter, with the explicit permission and approval of the Patriarch of Antioch, who would have been the patriarch covering that area, at least until Bishop Serapion disputed it in the early 3rd century. So here's a non-canonical gospel being read and used in liturgy into the 3rd century and a part of the church on the Eastern Mediterranean. That brings us to the Gospel of the Hebrews, sometimes called the Gospel according to the Hebrews, sometimes the Gospel to the Hebrews. The Gospel is lost, with only fragments of it surviving, and surviving only as brief quotations from the early church fathers or in other apocryphal writings. Perhaps a copy of it too will one day be discovered buried in the sands of Egypt. It was probably composed in Greek in the first decades of the 2nd century, which makes it contemporary at least with perhaps the writing of the last books of the New Testament. And it's believed to have been used by Greek-speaking Jewish Christians in Egypt during that century, just as the so-called Gospel of Peter was being used in that century in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Gospel of the Hebrews is the only Jewish Christian gospel which the church fathers refer to by name, believing there was only one gospel to the Hebrews, but perhaps in different versions, because passages from the gospel were quoted or summarized by the 3 Alexandrian fathers, Alexandria being a major center of the early church, and the fathers, St. Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, and Didymus the Blind, all quote the Gospel of the Hebrews. It was also quoted by Jerome, but that may have been through the commentaries of Origen and not direct knowledge. Modern scholars classify the Gospel of Hebrews as one of 3 potential Jewish Christian Gospels, along with the Gospel of the Nazarenes or the Gospel of the Ebionites. Whether these are all the same Gospels and different names for them or different Hebrew Gospels is uncertain. They may be referring to one in the same book, but they are known to us only from fragments preserved in quotations from the early church fathers. Unlike other Jewish Christian Gospels, the Gospel of Hebrews shows no dependence upon the Gospel of Matthew. It seems to be an independent telling. The story of the first resurrection in the Gospel of Hebrew has the first appearance to James the Just, which suggests that the Jewish Christian community produced this document to claim James as their founder. Just as Andrew was important to certain Orthodox traditions, or Peter is important in certain Western traditions, in the more Jewish Christian tradition, James was the more important follower of Jesus. And remember, James was one who seemed to chair and speak up at the first council of the church in Jerusalem. So the Gospel of Hebrews seems to be an independent of the New Testament in its quoted portions. And since it's not extant, it's difficult to know whether unquoted portions of the Gospel might show dependence on the synoptics going one way or the other. Hegesippus, who an early church father in the late 2nd century, and Eusebius, the great church historian of the early 4th century, both attest to the existence of this gospel, but they don't quote from it. Fragments were preserved in Clement and in Origen and Cyril and Didymus the Blind and Jerome. The extent of the gospel then is sadly unknown to us, though we know that it existed in the 2nd and 3rd century and right into the 4th century. In the so-called Gospel of the Egyptians, the story is told differently. And among the women who were followers of Jesus, it is Salome, who's mentioned only by Mark in the New Testament, who seems to take on a prominent place. The image above is a picture of the women at the tomb. The Gospel of the Egyptians is also no longer extant, but it was mentioned by Hippolytus, 2nd century, and Epiphanius, of 4th, early 5th century, Hippolytus in Rome, Epiphanius in the East. Most of our citations from the Gospel of the Egyptians comes from Clement of Alexandria, 2nd century, and there's also a reference to it in the excerpts of Theodotus. The Gospel was apparently used in Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries. So you're getting the sense that there are different Gospels out there that different communities of Christians are using in different places. This Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, which is entirely different from a later Gnostic Coptic Gospel of the Egyptians, this Gospel, the Greek version, was probably written in the 2nd quarter of the 2nd century, as it's already cited by Clement of Alexandria at the end of that century, where quotations give us many of the Greek excerpts that are all that remain, all that we know of. It's also mentioned by Hippolytus, who alludes to various changes of the soul set forth in the Gospel according to the Egyptians and connects it with the Gnostic group, the Nicene sect in Egypt. Later, that 4th century collector of heresies, Epiphanius of Salamis, asserts that the Sabellians made use of this gospel, though it is unlikely that he had any first-hand knowledge about Sabellius, who taught in the 3rd century, 150 years before him. But you're beginning to see a pattern later, in the 4th century especially, that gospels that are accepted are assigned to apostles, and gospels that are rejected are assigned to heretics, to known heretics. Whether any of those stories are true is unknown. Another gospel that is lost to us, but then was discovered in the 20th century, is the so-called Gospel of Mary. The Mary here being Mary Magdalene, not Mary, the mother of Jesus. Only 3 fragmentary manuscripts are known to have survived. 2 3rd century fragments, and published in 1938 and 1983, and a longer 5th century Coptic translation published in 1955. 3 fragments of the so-called Gospel of Mary. There are, however, some important variations between the Greek and Coptic manuscripts, and scholars usually give preference, once again, to the Greek fragments over the Coptics because they're earlier and because they're written in the original language of the text, or what is believed to be the original language of the text. And also because the Coptic variants begin to reflect theological tendencies that arguably belong to a later time, just as we saw some of the changes in the texts in an earlier class belonging to a later time. For example, the Greek fragments, and here's a good distinction between the Greek and the Coptic versions of the Gospel of Mary. In the Greek fragments, Mary Magdalene plays a role, a significant role as a source of information in this gospel. And her role as a woman is not what's debated. Only her teachings are debated and challenged in the text. But by the time of the Coptic version, the point toward a situation in which her very role as a leader, as a woman, is now being challenged and also requires defense. And those changes suggest to scholars that as the church, Jesus was much more accepting of women than the later church. Even Paul was more accepting of women than the later church. And as women began to be sidelined, they would be reflected in the texts, and the Coptic version may represent a later version. There is a confrontation of Mary in this gospel with Peter that is often referred to. And it's a scenario that we also find in other places, in the Pistis Sophia, in the Gospel of the Egyptians, and in the Gospel of Thomas. And it reflects some of the tensions of 2nd century Christianity. Peter and Andrew represent what become Orthodox later, but in those days were proto-Orthodox positions that deny the validity of esoteric revelation and reject the authority of women to teach. The Gospel of Mary attacks both of these positions head-on through its portrayal of Mary Magdalene. She is the Savior's beloved, and therefore it is argued she possesses knowledge and teaching superior to that of the public apostolic tradition. And this is an early theme in the early church. Do we accept revelations once we have written texts? Once the apostles die, what do we rely upon? And there were later groups within the church, like the Montanists in the 2nd century, who continued to be very charismatic and have new revelations that were often different from the written texts and witnesses produced in the 1st and 2nd century. So as with canonical gospels, cultural and historical influences will often taint our texts later, as we noted earlier. And such theological changes are only human constructs reflecting and revealing the biases of the author. But it's clear that in the Greek version of the Gospel of Mary that it's early because her role as a woman is not challenged, only her testimony. Finally, let us consider the so-called Gospel of Judas, another one of those lost Gospels which has risen to prominence now in the 21st century. A leather-bound Coptic language papyrus surfaced in the 1970s near Beni Massar in Egypt and was first translated in the early 2000s. The codex that contains the text appears to be from the late 2nd century and includes the self-titled The Gospel of Judas. Many of these texts are anonymous and the ascriptions to them, like with our canonical gospels later. But this one actually declares itself to be the Gospel of Judas, which relates the story of Jesus' death then from the viewpoint of his apostle Judas. The manuscript, interestingly, was radiocarbon dated by the National Geographic Society, and it showed this actual text being as old as 220 to 340 within 60 years. Today, the manuscript is in over 1,000 pieces. It's an example of not taking care of these things. Numerous sections are missing because of poor handling or storage. Some passages are only scattered words. Others contain many lines. According to the Coptic scholar Rodolphe Casseur, the codex originally included 31 leaves, each written on both sides. But by the time the codex came to market in 1999, only 13 leaves survived. Individual leaves may have been moved or sold separately. They may turn up again sometime in the future. The content consists in this gospel of conversation between Judas Iscariot and Jesus. Given that it includes late century, 2nd century theology, it is thought to have been composed in the late 2nd century by Gnostic Christians, rather than the historic Judas himself, as it claims to be. And so here is an example, and we'll find there's a lot more of this in the 3rd and 4th century, of different groups making up gospels and attaching an apostolic name to it to promote their theology. The only known copy of this gospel is in the Coptic language, which, as noted, was dated to 280 AD. And it is suggested, as the case with others, that Coptic, which was an Egyptian language, was most likely translated from the original Greek. That most literary works at that time in that place in the Mediterranean were written in Greek first, and then often translated into Coptic or Syrian or Hebrew, as you'll see. In contrast to the canonical Gospels, which paint Judas as a betrayer who delivered Jesus to the authorities of crucifixion in exchange for money, the Gospel of Judas portrays Judas's actions as done in obedience, in strict obedience to instructions given to him by Jesus of Nazareth. It has also been speculated on the basis of textual analysis that feature the dialect of Greek used at the time or Greek loanwords that were picked up in the time, that the Coptic text contained in the Codex may have been a translation that goes back as far as 130 to 170 AD, which brings it very close to some of the other early Gospels, both canonical and non-canonical. Cited in support is the reference to the Gospel of Thomas by the early Christian writer, again, Irenaeus of Lyons, at the end of the 2nd century, who, in arguing against Gnosticism about 180, described the text as fictitious history. However, it's uncertain whether the text mentioned by Irenaeus is in fact the same as the Coptic Gospel of Judas that we have. So, as can be seen here from this sampling of different stories, there were numerous Gospels circulating in the early centuries of the Christian church, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Different communities seem to know or to favor one Gospel over others. They may not know the other ones. Interestingly, the only surviving Gospel codices, books of the first half of the 2nd century, contain only one work. These were extremely rare in some cases. They had to be manually transcribed by a copyist. That took time and that took money. So the texts were very valuable and not necessarily very, very widespread. So the only surviving books of the first half of the 2nd century contain only one work. Individual books seem to have been copied and passed around as available. The idea of a set fourfold gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is not even suggested, as we'll see, till the end of the 2nd century, though it does seem to become more and more common in the 3rd century. Thus, the texts of these gospels do not themselves seem to be sacred or inviolable, as we'll see in a minute. As we saw, however, earlier, with how certain stories are added into the canonical gospels that we have. The wonderful story of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John, which is believed to be an authentic story, is not authentic to the Gospel of John. And so in the same way, with the different endings of the Gospel of Mark, were added later. Stories that were considered to be of value or need were often added into these. All of which brings us to Marcion. Marcion is the son of a bishop in Pontus in Asia Minor, in modern-day Turkey. Rhodo and Tertullian, who were both young men in Marcion's old age, described him as a mariner or a shipmaster. Sometime in the late 130s, Marcion traveled to Rome, is known to have joined the Roman Church, the Christian church in Rome, but was expelled in 144 AD. After this, it appears that Marcion returned to Asia Minor, where he continued to lead many Christian congregations in Asia Minor. And those Christian congregations that he led use what scholars now call, for the sake of clarity, the Gospel of Marcion, but what his followers called the Gospel of the Lord. So in his congregations, in their liturgy, when the Gospel of the Lord would be read, they would be reading from the Gospel of Marcion, but no manuscript of the Gospel of Marcion survives, partly because he's later declared to be a heretic, and so all their works were discouraged or destroyed. But scholars have been able to largely reconstruct the text from the numerous quotations about him and from him in the writings of the early church fathers, in the writings of Irenaeus, Tertullian in North Africa and beginning of the 3rd century, Epiphanius in the 4th century in Syria. The majority of scholars agree too that what Marcion seems to have is an edited version of what we call the Gospel of Luke. Marcion declares himself to have been a follower of Paul the Apostle, who he believes was the only true apostle of Jesus Christ. And besides his gospel, Marcion published or collected the earliest extant collection of New Testament books that we have. It included Marcion's Gospel, the Gospel of Marcion, apparently abbreviated form of the Gospel of Luke, and 10 Pauline epistles, not including the pastoral letters, which were thought to be later. So he may have an authentic collection of 10 letters of Paul and either an edited version of Luke or an earlier version of Luke. And this was the New Testament collection that his followers heard on Sundays in church. The late 2nd century writer Tertullian in North Africa late second, early third, stated that Marcion, quote, expunged from the Gospel of Luke all the things that oppose his viewpoint, but retained those things that accord with his opinion. Scholars have entertained that both Luke and Marcion's Gospel are edited versions, however, of some earlier prior Gospel, that Tertullian just assumed he took out these parts that Tertullian was familiar with in Luke that weren't there in Marcion's. And therefore, the Gospel of Marcion may be closer to the original than the canonical Gospel of Luke. So it's important. It not only is an early collection of a New Testament, no Jewish writings involved here, no Old Testament, just an edited version or an early version of Luke and 10 Pauline letters. Another example of how the gospel texts of the 2nd century were not held as sacred or inviolable, that you could take out passages or exclude them, is the work of Tatian the Syrian, circa 120 to 180. As a young man, Tatian traveled to Rome and became a Christian there with the Christian church at Rome. And he became a student there of Justin Martyr, a leader of the church in Rome. Justin had started a school for Christians, and Tatian, following the example of his mentor, also started a school for Christians in Rome. But after the martyrdom of Justus in 165, which is why he's called Justin the Martyr, Tatian appears to have moved east. At some point, Tatian produced what's called the Diatessaron, which appears to be a biblical paraphrase or a harmony of the 4 later canonical Gospels. It is a single book which contains verses which appear to be from different sources. The Diatessaron was extremely popular and widely used in the Syrian churches right into the 5th century, when it was replaced in those Syrian churches that used it because the bishop of Edessa, who would be one of the leading authorities in that area, Rabula in particular is his name, he ordered the priests and deacons to see that every church should have a copy of the separate Gospels. So by the 5th century in Syria, it's clear that there are separate Gospels that are considered accepted, but this is the 5th century. But that earlier, they had used the Diatessaron of Tatian. In fact, Theodoret, the bishop of Cyrus, removed, we are told, 200 copies of the Diatessaron from the churches in his diocese in the 5th century. So the Diatessaron was widely popular in Syria. Scholars will argue as to what the sources were of Tatian's Diatessaron. An easy solution would be if he just took the 4 canonical Gospels and blended it into a single story, as we often do ourselves with the Christmas story or the Passion and Resurrection. But there are hints that he may have had other sources and may not have known all 4 of the canonical Gospels. It's not clear. What is clear is that they were not using any of the 4 canonical Gospels in Syria. They were using his Diatessaron. Which brings us to Irenaeus. Irenaeus, who we've quoted before, from Alexandria, 130 to 202, so early 2nd century. He's a Greek bishop because that was the language of the empire. He was noted for his role in guiding and expanding Christian communities, and eventually he was in the south of France. He originated from Smyrna in Greece, where he had seen, he says, and heard the preaching of Polycarp, who we had talked about before. Polycarp is important because he's the last known living connection with the apostles, or so he is thought to be because of what Irenaeus says. Irenaeus tells us that Polycarp was a student of John the Evangelist, John the son of Zebedee, who wrote, Irenaeus argues, the 4th Gospel. Although there's some dispute about this, and some scholars will argue that Irenaeus is mistaken, that Polycarp was a student of John the Presbyter, or John of Antioch, who appears to have written at least the 2nd and 3rd letter of St. John, if not others. But nowhere before Irenaeus is there any specific mention of the 4-fold gospel canon, of the four canonical gospels being held together in some sense of exclusivity, that these are the sacred ones and the others are rejected. The other evidence from the time, as you can see, suggests that the four later canonical gospels were beginning to achieve some significance and recognition, beginning to be quoted more and more by a widespread group of church fathers as sources of tradition in the post-apostolic church. But not that they were regarded as an exclusive group or an inviolable norm. Nonetheless, Irenaeus states, as you see here, that it's not possible for the Gospels to be more or fewer in number than they are. He then continued with a long allegorical interpretation why there could only be four Gospels, noting, for instance, there are four zones in the known world, four principal winds, four faces to the cherubim, four principal covenants. He goes on and on about this for a while. So he suggests that towards the end of the 2nd century, we do have the first obvious example of the fourfold gospel collection of what we know as the canonical gospels. And that it appears in southern France at the end of the 2nd century. But his remarks, his allegorical justification seems to suggest that this is an innovation, that it's not a firmly established tradition of four gospels, that that's not generally accepted, and so that he has to go to some trouble in this tortured insistence on its numerical legitimacy. But there is the beginning of a sense of a fourfold gospel at the end of the 2nd century. And during the 3rd century, we find that repeated more and more as the four later canonical gospels come to hold a more central place in the life of the church, generally, than it had in the past. Although there are still principal examples like the Dia Tessaron in Syria, or the use of the Gospel of Peter and Rosas that go into the 5th century. So, hopefully, as a result of these scattered examples, it is clear that there are a wide variety of gospel accounts out there that were in use in the 2nd and 3rd century that claim early authorship, like the canonical gospels, that their contents themselves were often altered, that different regions and different groups of Christians knew and or favored different gospels over others. Well into the 5th century, which brings us to the medieval legend about how the formation of the Christian Bible took place. And this, sadly, is still generally thought by people today. According to a much later medieval legend, the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, was the last of the apostles to survive, dying there on the island of Patmos, but before his death, composing what we now call the Gospel of John, and writing down his visions there in the book of what we now call the book of Revelation. And that he added his 2 books to the other books that he had received, which consist of the canonical New Testament, the books that we have in pretty much undisputed. We'll see more of that next time in the New Testament. And that he had this New Testament put together as he died at the end of the apostolic age that he could then pass on to the church as a secure and sacred witness that should take precedence over oral tradition or later revelations like the Montanists in the 2nd century. And that these books that John bound together included only Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each of whom had written down exactly what the Holy Spirit whispered them to reach. You see the Holy Spirit here as a dove in one part and as an angel in other, so that these were sacred texts because the exact words were given to them by the Holy Spirit, and that together they formed the Holy Bible, consisting of what is generally the Old and New Testament. So in conclusion, it's clear from the quotation of Luke, at least, that the 4 canonical Gospels are not necessarily the oldest accounts of the life of Jesus. Luke, the author of Luke, knows of many others, and we have seen other examples of others. The four canonical Gospels are anonymous, like many of these other works. They're not necessarily apostolic, that is, written by the apostles or based on their testimony. That seems to be a later tradition imposed upon these works to try to win or gain them favor. The synoptic problem, as we saw earlier, described in the last class, revealed that the writers of the four canonical Gospels were not necessarily eyewitnesses either, that they were using bits and pieces of other works, probably written, but perhaps oral tradition as well, and that they felt free to alter the works or blend the works as befit their interests. The traditional attributions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are later. The four were not generally considered a closed collection until the 3rd century. In the 2nd century, we saw Marcion appeared to know only the Gospel of Luke. The Syrian church and Tatian's Diatessaron, his harmony, was being used in Syria well into the 5th century. In the 4th century, the Gospel of Hebrews was being used in Egypt. In the 5th century, the church at Rhosis was using the Gospel of Peter on Sundays with the express permission of the patriarch. And in the 4th century, there was also a group in Greece and Asia Minor called the Alogi, or the Alogi, who were opposed to the acceptance, to the growing acceptance of the so-called Gospel of John within the church and the writings of John. So there's a debate going on as to which books will be acceptable and which books wouldn't be. And as we saw, as the debate goes on, we tend to associate apostles with those we like and heretics with those we don't. But in the end, there's no easy answer as to why the four canonical Gospels were chosen for the church and others were not. They're not necessarily the oldest. They're not necessarily the most authentic. They're not necessarily the most apostolic. But they did become popular through much, though not all of the church, by the 3rd and 4th centuries. The biblical scholar Bruce Metzger wrote regarding the formation of the New Testament canon, quote, "Although the fringes of the emerging canon remain unsettled for generations, a high degree of unanimity concerning the greater part of the New Testament was attained among the very diverse and scattered congregations of believers, not only through the Mediterranean world, but also over an area extending from Britain to Mesopotamia." So there was a growing consensus, but there are no clear guidelines or directions as to what decided what books were in and what books were not. And even when written Gospels were becoming customary and preferred over oral tradition, remember Papias preferred oral tradition over any of these writings, the authority of the written texts as received were not absolute. As we've seen, the texts have been altered or added to or harmonized or maybe cut. There is a conservative evangelical desire to move the acceptance of the authority of the later four canonical Gospels as early as possible so that we have a clear and authentic tradition of Jesus. And we want that as early as possible. But as we've seen, and thus the medieval legend, which wants to solidify that, there were numerous discussions. There were questions about familiarity and what people knew and didn't know. There was dispute about what was acceptable and not. And there were various letters of Paul, some accepted, some not, some at different times, and different books of Acts, and different apocalyptic revelations, like the revelation of St. Peter, which was widely read and widely used. And so how then did these discussions get settled? When was the entire New Testament agreed upon by the Christian church? And by whom? And by what authority and on what grounds? And that is the topic for our next adult class series. So in the next chapter or class of this adult Bible, we'll look at about Bible study. We'll look at the most obvious question, I think, that comes after you've considered translation and the problems with that, and texts and the problems with that. and the writing of our so-called canonical gospels and what we know about them and the problems with that, and now they're spread in the church and they're gaining wider acceptance, the next question, it seems to me logically, is what do we know about how the rest of the New Testament became accepted, became canonical? How did it become the Christian Bible? That's what we'll look at next time. I hope you found this class helpful and you'll join us again. And if you haven't viewed the earlier versions of this class, they're all available on the St. John's YouTube page. So I wish you well. Until next time, good night and God bless.